from Politics PA. I'm Steve Ulrich. This is Voices of Reason. Thank you for joining us. Election integrity. You've heard the words. You'll continue to hear it from now through the presidential election. What does it mean? What is the misinformation that is taking hold in the Commonwealth? What's the signal through the noise? We'll have a conversation with Secretary of the Commonwealth, Al Schmidt, and an outstanding roundtable as we take a look at election integrity. Thanks for joining us on Voices of Reason. Now on Voices of Reason, we're pleased to be joined by Paul Westcott, Executive Vice President of L2 Data. L2 Data provides such illuminating and fascinating maps for politicos, not only in the Commonwealth, but around the country. Paul, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here.
What do the maps tell us about the victories for Dave Sunday for Republican Attorney General and Eugene DePasquale on the Democratic side?
Well, really, when it comes to primary elections, as you know, and as I'm sure anyone listening to this knows, this is, primaries are a very small percentage of the electorate, but it makes targeting all that more important, right? Finding those people who are most likely to show up. And I think both on the Democrat and Republican side this time around, they kind of embraced early voting in a bigger way. Certainly the Republican side showing up in a lot of different places. So we took a look at specifically the early return data. We're going to get the full return data here over the next, couple weeks and months. But we updated the whole file just to kind of take a look at, who this early return group is. Around 705,000 individuals, around 8.5% of the total electorate. And if I dig into the numbers a little bit, you can see the map is very purpley blue. So there's a lot of Democrats in the turnout, but almost 25.5% Republican, which for Republicans, banking votes early, in 2020 was kind of a bad word and sort of a bad thing to do or frowned upon. But now I think Republicans and state committee members and others are starting to come around to it and saying we need to turn, and these campaigns, of course, we need to start turning people out early, banking votes early. So when it comes to election day, we can start pushing people over the top. And I think it speaks to a strategy you're going to see go into the fall. And when I took a look at it, I was curious sort of where those heavy Republican turnout areas were across the state. So I clicked on Republican here and just took a look at, the ballots we've seen returned so far. I scroll up, and if I do a quick sort by the total number of voters, Allegheny, Bucks, Montgomery, Chester, Lancaster, that's usually by virtue of the fact that there are just more people in these counties. If I change it to the percent of results, this gives us just a little bit more of a granular way to look at the data. This is looking at the total number of people by a percentage in that county that voted and who happened to be Republican. So Cameron County, which I needed to find on the map, it's up here, sort of the center west on the map. I bet you knew where it was, Steve. But I looked at Cameron County, and you could see 146 of the 2,800 total voters, around 5%, were Republican, showed up. However, among the bigger counties that we see, you can see Bucks County right there, 3% of the electorate, showing up among that group. 14,000 people registered Republicans, of course, in one of the swingier counties in the state. So I think it's something worth noting that you're going to see sort of a heavier turnout among Republicans. This group overall, though, taking a step back and looking at the map as a whole, what you can see is, again, 705,000 total voters among early return data, much more heavily Democratic. I'll get rid of that percent of totals here, and we'll just look at the total number of voters overall. And when I took a look at all of the voters who showed up, mostly white, much more heavily than the overall state demographics. Around 73%. When you go into age, mostly on the older side, so 65 plus, around 65% or so, and over 55, that's close to 80% of voters in a primary. Again, not super surprising, given sort of what is a state-centric primary during this year. And then, of course, going into some of the other, demographics that we have within turnout. Gender was a big one that I took a look at, around 58% female. Now, I don't know if that's just purely because Democrats' turnout has been generally larger and there are generally more female Democrats than there are Republicans. But at the end of the day, everyone's thinking about sort of, the abortion issue, things like that. How is that going to affect turnout overall? That has obviously played into some of these races across the state. And so you're seeing that overwhelming, like a much larger spread here than you would typically, whereas the state is around 52-48 female male. This is 58-41.
Were you able to divine anything from the results for either the treasurer or the AG race, or do those need to be certified first to really be able to dig into the data?
Those really need to be certified where we need to dive into them. So the state takes around 4 to 6 weeks for the counties to be able to return each of their data, back, and then basically allowing us to take a much deeper dive into it. Obviously, like I said, I think what we're seeing that's trailing into some of the other elections that we're looking at across the state and some of the early voting among the presidential primary, you are seeing heavier turnout in terms of, again, heavier turnout in terms of women, older women, white.
One of the things that L2 does extremely well is digs into the data and can tell us more about election integrity. This week's topic on Voices of Reason. I know we're fortunate to have you with us working with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. You've done some work with other states. What have you been able to learn about the thoughts about behind election integrity, what people say, the passive misinformation, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, so election integrity is obviously a huge topic, and a huge topic among our clients. So a lot of people want to find and I like that here on Voices of Reason, I can be a source of truth. That's what people like to call the voter file, is the source of truth. So how can we give that baseline information as to who's who, because that's really where everything starts. So what we do with a lot in terms of election integrity is in some corners, and I'm not going to name names of organizations that we do work with in this respect, but basically what we do is, in some respects, we're looking at past elections and saying who actually turned out. Did these people live there? Are these people still alive? Did they die in between submitting the early return ballot and the election, or did they die prior to that and their household received an extra ballot? There's instances where people move out and they receive a ballot. So there's always questions around that. And of course, the biggest question is, does it matter? Is it statistically significant enough? There's always going to be errors when you're dealing with millions of voters and a state bureaucracy that's putting out all this information. They're doing the best they can, but at the end of the day, is it going to be enough, and will it potentially sway the election? The other piece of this, of course, is with redistricting, and we have worked with numerous redistricting attorneys as well as organizations that have tried to help shape how the state is going to look and the Commonwealth is going to look. And we've done this across the country as well as in Pennsylvania. And really what they're looking at, when legislators or other they're called special masters, or other people who take on the tough issue of redistricting, they're looking at trying to be as fair as possible and create what is a lot of parity between some of these districts, and basically saying, are there enough people in each of these districts? Obviously you want a total number of people, but then they look at the voter file and say, what's the Republican Democrat split? What's the split in terms of younger versus older, white versus black versus Hispanic versus Asian? They'll look at all those different demographics and say, okay, well, let's craft the district in a certain way. And what we've seen is, lawsuit after lawsuit around that. In Pennsylvania, it's been less so this time around, but there's certainly, have of course been questions, and there will continue to be. We're already starting to work, and this is the first time I've been in this position for 2030. We're already looking at that in ways that we're going to be shaping. Data is going to be shaping the districts of the future, but that's how important both the lawmakers and the advocacy groups working on this know it is.
We'll close things out by introducing our L2 data point of the week. And you wanted to show us some maps about new turnout.
Yeah, so taking a look at some of that early return data from the primary. So what I'm going to do is scroll down here. I'm going to go back into voter history, voted earlier absentee from the presidential primary. I'm going to click down here. We're going to click on yes. So here's your 705,000 individuals. They're going to pop up. And then I'm going to go to vote for, voting performance. I'm sorry, I'm learning how to work my own system here. And then I go down to even year primaries. And one of the things I'll immediately look at is not eligible and 0%. What we're basically looking at here is somebody's score. Everyone, if you're in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you have a score on L2's file and you're registered to vote. You either were not eligible to vote in the last even year primary, you voted 0%. If you voted half the time in which you were eligible, you voted 50%. And if you voted every time, you're at 100%. It's pretty straightforward. And this looks back at somebody's full voter history. So what we do is we look at the 0% and not eligible. So here's your new registrants that showed up to vote. There's around 14,600 of those people. And then the people who had never voted before, because the calculation does not include this primary yet, you're seeing 48,148. So that is not insignificant. That's around 8, 9% of the electorate that showed up for this year's presidential primary being a first time primary voter. I think what it says is that you're going to see sort of maybe new groups showing up in this election, and looking at who these voters are. If you dive into it, and so that's our number of the week is going to be this 8, 9% of individuals who showed up for this election. But looking at who they are, if I open up some of the individual demographics here, you can see their party split. It's going to be more heavily Democrat, but still 33% Republican for new voters. That's higher than the overall percentage turnout that we saw. You can see that the turnout is slightly more heavily, well, is more heavily female, but not by as much. And then among the age, you're seeing it's a little bit more dispersed because you do have a little bit more of the younger set in here, particularly those who are coming onto the ballot for the first time and showing up to vote. So I think this is going to be a very important group to watch. These are your Gen Z voters in some cases, these 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Which is kind of scary as my kids get close to that age. So, but that's who is able to show up now, and we're going to see a lot more of it.
Our thanks to Paul Westcott, Executive Vice President of L2 Data, for joining us. We'll be right back. Today's guest on Voices of Reason is Secretary of the Commonwealth, Al Schmidt. Secretary was appointed to his post in January of 2023. Previously, he had served as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Committee of 70, and prior to that, 10 years as Philadelphia City Commissioner, handling elections in the Commonwealth's largest state. Secretary Schmidt, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
We're just 6 days out from the presidential primary election. When you take a quick look back, and we know that it's not completed as of yet, but what grade do you give out, not only for the Department of State, but for the county election offices?
It's interesting. I was just walking through the Capitol right next door and had all sorts of people come up and congratulate me on how smooth the election was. But my response to every one of them is it's really our counties that run elections in Pennsylvania, and our county partners and their teams, their staff, and their poll workers did a fantastic job. Election day went very smoothly in Pennsylvania. The biggest disappointment, of course, was turnout. Turnout is typically driven by competition at the top of the ticket, as you know, and there really wasn't a competitive primary in the Democratic or Republican parties for president of the United States. So that undoubtedly had some effect. But I think the counties, new election directors and experienced election directors alike, really did an excellent job this past election.
One of the things we often talk about is how decentralized Pennsylvania elections are at 67 counties, handling things in 67 different ways, but with the coordination provided by the Department of State. Do you still think that's an excellent way of doing things?
I mean, and it does make things bumpy at times because, as I just said, elections are really run at the county level and all in accordance with the Pennsylvania election code. At the same time, there's some flexibility within that election code. And that's why at times you see counties approaching elections differently. Some provide mail-in ballot Board of Elections drop boxes. Some do not. Some allow voters to correct fatal defects before election day if they mailed in a ballot and they forgot to sign it or they forgot to date it or something like that. Others do not. So I think the big challenge is how do you really get the porridge just right? Because counties know their voters better than we do. And we have to respect that. And at the same time, make sure everybody's operating under the same election code. when I have testified before the House and the Senate, I certainly got some grief because of counties doing things somewhat differently. But I'm sure none of them would be okay with me, Secretary of the Department of State, telling all counties what they should do, whether they should all have drop boxes or no drop boxes. That is really for the legislature to decide. If they desire that sort of uniformity, which makes election administration a lot calmer and a lot more consistent, then that's really up to the legislature to take that step.
One problem that still remains is with the outer return mailing envelope. The Department of State made a point to redesign it to make it easier for voters to fill in the correct date, but some still had problems doing that. Are we left to believe that at this point that's just going to be a flaw to any type of mail in voting?
Every vote in Pennsylvania is precious. So the Department of State and our county partners do everything we can to make sure within the confines of the law that voters' votes can be counted. Votes cast by an eligible registered voter on or before election day. Department of State earlier this year redesigned, as you mentioned, the outer declaration envelope to try to minimize against fatal defects. That includes signing it and dating it and including your ballot in the secrecy envelope. So we did some redesign. The counties are still scanning in the declaration envelopes. The vote counting is largely over, other than sort of provisionals and other types of ballots that they still need to adjudicate. But in terms of updating voter records, in terms of if there was an error in that declaration envelope or not, that's still ongoing. And then once that process is completed in just a few days, I think we'll have a very clear picture of the extent to which this redesign has helped minimize against voters making those sort of errors.
You've made it a point with your administration to talk about be as transparent as possible, and you have spent the last week doing social media messages and YouTube videos just talking about where things stood with the Commonwealth. What feedback did you get from that? And do you plan to continue to do that going forth to November?
Yeah, the feedback was positive, and transparency is important. And like you said, Steve, and as you know, um, at least in my experience, the more people know about elections, the more confidence they have in the results. And elections have changed a lot in the past couple of years. With new voting systems for in-person voting, with vote by mail in Pennsylvania beginning in primary 2020. So it's natural for people to have questions. And I think it's important that we answer those questions and make sure that people understand that elections have never been made more safe and secure in Pennsylvania, with a voter verifiable paper ballot record of every vote that's cast that is used in two audits after every election to ensure that the tabulated results are accurate.
Could you expound on that a little bit about the risk limiting audit and the 2% audit and what exactly voters, citizens of the Commonwealth can take away and feel good about those audits being conducted?
After every election in Pennsylvania, there are two types of reviews or audits that are carried out. The one, as you describe it, in shorthand, we call it the 2% audit. It's a 2% audit of all ballots that were cast and recorded to ensure that those results are accurate. It's either 2% or 2,000 ballots in a county, depending on the total number of votes. So that is one method to ensure that the tabulated results are accurate. The other is something called a risk limiting audit, which is a scientifically designed auditing system where ballots are also counted to ensure that the tabulated results are accurate, so that the audit can show with the highest order of certainty that the election results are accurate. So I think it's important that we conduct those audits, and uh, they're open to the public. So transparency, I think, plays an important role in people having confidence in election results.
One of the things that I know a lot of listeners probably read about in the lead up to the primary was the safety of election officials and the challenges that were presented after the 2020 election. Certainly, You've been very outspoken about your situation and what it was like running elections in the city of Philadelphia during that 2020 election. Did you get any reports of any problems within the Commonwealth, or is the word getting out there that, for lack of a better phrase, I guess these folks are the champions of democracy and leave them alone?
Well, taking from lessons learned in the past, um, with elections before this administration began, the Shapiro administration created an election threats task force that is really uh, entities responsible for running elections, partnering with law enforcement, so that lines of communication are very clear. Everyone knows what everyone else's responsibilities are. So if any of that ugliness from 2020 returns, and I hope it doesn't, that everyone will be prepared so that law enforcement can do its job, which allows our election directors and our election administrators at the county level to do their job and not be distracted or intimidated by any threats of violence or any of that.
Given that Pennsylvania is the swing state of 2024, how do you prepare the team to be ready for the spotlight that's going to be shown on the Commonwealth, not only this fall, but in November?
Well, the good news, Steve, is there's no need to remind anyone, whether it's at the Department of State or at the county level, of the amount of scrutiny um, that comes along with this sort of election cycle. Um, and it's also why we created in the Shapiro administration a training team, so that we can provide new election directors with the training they need to run elections smoothly. I wish that I had had it when I was starting out running elections in 2012. So this training team, led by an experienced county election administrator, has I think had a lot of success and a lot of interest. 50 to 100 people attend these trainings, and it's really to assist newer election directors. As you can imagine, when you have newer election administrators, they're more likely to make mistakes. They don't know what to look for. They don't know what to prepare for. Um, and it's a matter of making mistakes in an environment that is extremely unforgiving, with extremely high scrutiny, and any mistake being interpreted as being nefarious or seeking to change the outcome one way or another. So the Department of State is doing what it can and should to be of service to our counties, who again are on the front of running elections in Pennsylvania.
If you were to leave a message for the citizens of Pennsylvania as to what to expect coming up in this very heated, contentious election cycle, uh, what words of advice, what words of wisdom would you have for them?
Well, the big disappointment in this last primary, like I said, was the turnout was so low. And I think the main thing is, and it sounds like a cliche, but it's really important that every voter, every eligible voter register to vote, and every registered voter cast their vote, so that everyone can make sure their voice is heard. And while I don't necessarily regard any office as more important than any other, municipal offices can have a bigger effect on your life than who the president of the United States is. But there's certainly a lot of tension that comes along with that. People certainly have strong feelings about that. And the electorate, not just in Pennsylvania, but everywhere, is pretty narrowly divided. So every vote counts. And I think it's just important that voters make sure they're ready, make sure they're registered, and cast their vote, and have a plan for election day.
Couldn't agree with you more. We had one state house that's decided by 8 votes, so every vote does count. And we want to say thank you very much to Secretary of the Commonwealth Al Schmidt for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Thank you, Steve.
Now on Voices of Reason, we're joined by former Mercer County Election Director Jeff Greenberg, now Senior Election Advisor with the Committee of 70, and also former Dauphin County Election Director Jerry Fieser. Jerry now retired after 10 years serving Dauphin County. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Thanks for having us, Steve.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
One of the big things that we talk about when we discuss election integrity is the general misinformation that's out there right now among the electorate, and what's going on with voting machines, or why can't we have poll watchers. I'm going to throw this out to I'll throw it out to Jeff first. It doesn't seem like necessarily we've lost election integrity. We've just lost a little bit of trust in the people that do it. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, one of the things that I always thought was a strength of elections actually turned out to be a weakness. During my tenure in Mercer County, we very rarely, despite the transparency that's embedded in the law in Pennsylvania when it comes to elections and election administration, we very rarely had our residents or citizens come observe or take the opportunity to come watch the work that we do, our testing, and all the other stuff. And I always took that as a sign of trust. They trusted the work we were doing in the office. They didn't need to be there to look over our shoulder. But that proved to be a weakness, unfortunately, after we hit 2020 in the last few years, when once that trust started to erode, we did not really have a good foundation for people to understand the work that elections officials do. So, absolutely agree.
Jerry, it seems like one of the things election directors do is they will invite members of the Republican or Democratic Party or any party that's running for office in to see how machines are tested and things like that. You have poll worker education sessions, but it still doesn't seem to be carrying the day. Why do you think that is?
I don't know either. In the tenure that I was there for 10 years, I had exactly 3 people come in for logic and accuracy testing. All 3 were poll workers. 2 of them were judges of election, just because they were curious. They wanted to see how it worked. And I would argue though with Jeff that it didn't start in 2020. I'd go back to 2016 when people started to question and challenge the results and things like that. It really, the wheels came off the bus in 2020. But there was some suspicions back in 2016 that things were not correct. We had petitions for recounts in various election districts because people weren't satisfied with those results. And after 2016, I think you agree, Jeff, that's where the push to change voting equipment. All of our old systems were decertified. We all had to buy new systems. And, in Dauphin County, we went from a full faced DRE voting machine, direct record election electronic machine, to paper ballots. The machines that we were using had been in use for 35 years. And while the new paper ballots do indeed provide a accurate record of every vote cast, there were no questions on the old machines. Everybody trusted them because they were in use for 35 years. People were used to them. And, so I think a lot of that was the changes that took place after 2016, before 2020. It started to cause people to question, well, wait a minute, why are we voting differently? Why are these new machines here? Why do I have to fill out a paper ballot? I like the old machines.
Yeah, and
It's
and I'd like to just to add to Jerry's point real quick about the emphasis on change impacting the trust level. When we went from, and I was a reporter back in that day, from the lever machines to the Ivatronics in our county, or to the touch screens. We didn't have Ivatronics at first. Back in the early 2000s, I did some research at the time and found stories from like the early 20th century when counties were going from paper ballots to the lever machines. And the electorate back then didn't trust the lever machines. They did not trust the mechanics of it, and it was interesting. It really opened up that idea that it's the idea of change that sometimes leads to that lack of trust. And whenever you're doing something differently, whether it's mail voting, expansion of mail voting, changing voting equipment, there's always going to be a diminishing trust factor that you have to respond to.
with the decentralization in Pennsylvania's election system, 67 counties doing, in some sense, 67 different things. Wouldn't it be best at some point for the Department of State perhaps to step in and say, this is the way things should be done?
Um,
Well, they did in a way with the whole new voting systems. But again, I still think the 67 counties running elections is better because, when you talk about hackability and things like that, when you get into the cyber attacks and things like that, if you were to be able to get into one system, then you have the whole entire election compromised. So I think the 67 counties are a good buffer for that. But I do agree there needs to be better directive, more clarity in some of the election reforms, election changes that took place in Act 77. You know, Act 77 was not, um, it was the first major change, I think, since the 1930s. When you agree, Jeff?
Yes.
And with that, they ended up having to change Act 77 because they didn't get it right. And then there was another bill that changed aspects of it. So it was not. It was such a knee-jerk reaction. If you remember, I mean, Jeff, we were deeply involved in the 2019 municipal election, and a month before the election, they popped out Act 77 and signed it into law. We were, dumbstruck because none of us even knew that this
Yeah.
was on the train tracks, let alone going down as fast as it did.
Yeah, there was no, I don't remember very much interaction, if any, with the election officials at the time. Look, yeah, I agree with Jerry on the security issue and the security side of having the 67 counties running their elections and having separate election systems. But when you talk about issues like Act 77, and our General Assembly did not finish its job. So they started the job by implementing it, but they didn't finish it. And so here we are several years later, still litigating drop boxes. We're still litigating notice and cure. We're still litigating all of these undated ballots. These are things that the General Assembly needs to fix. There are areas where the counties need to be uniform when
Yeah.
it comes to those types of issues, and what are the requirements needed? How does a county does a county need to reach out to a voter? How do they reach out? When do they reach out? We should It shouldn't be that is those are the types of issues that we do need guidance, not from the Department of State, but from our General Assembly. They need to put this stuff in statute, and quite honestly, they need to do it yesterday. Things like pre-canvassing, which have been on the table for years. These are simple election administration issues. I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second, so please excuse me. My line has been recently that all of us in the election space, lawmakers, advocates, everybody, we have to stop asking what we can do for ourselves and start asking what we can do for elections officials and election administration. If we finally get to that point where we are putting elections officials and election administration first on our bucket list, then we will start to solve a lot of these problems, and a lot of these issues will hopefully go away.
I couldn't agree with you more. And when you stop and think about it, I don't think most folks realize. I know when I worked in York County, 159 precincts, these are all operated by your friends and neighbors. Certainly the judges of election, the majority inspectors are elected, but everyone else there is volunteering their time essentially, or making very minimal money for the amount of work they do on that day. And Jerry, that's really important to the transparency point of this, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the biggest frustrations. I know all three of us felt that, when it was time for judges and inspectors to run for office, there were more blanks on the ballot than there were, people on the ballot. And that's exactly where the rubber meets the road. I mean, my greatest relief in preparing an election was the Saturday before, because that's when the poll workers were coming to pick up the last of the election supplies. And it was the manifestation of me literally taking the election preparation off my shoulders and putting it on their shoulders. Election day is run by the local election elected boards, your neighbors, your friends, the people you see at the local baseball games or the local shopping stores. Go to church with them, work with them. Those are the people who, they're not quite volunteers because, like you said, Steve, they do get paid. Certainly not a decent rate, but they do get paid for it. But they're the ones who actually run it. So you talk about the Department of State handling everything and having one operation of elections, and whether it's 67, but it's not just one Dauphin County, it's 158 election districts having 158 election judges. We've trained them as best we can, but still they're individuals, they're humans, and they may act slightly different based on their interpretation of how they're to do their job.
And Jeff, I always kind of refer to those folks as the real champions of democracy. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. I always use that line. I said they were the foundation of the building of democracy. Without them, without that foundation, the building doesn't stand. And look, we focused on this a little bit as well when it comes to those concerns of integrity. The two best ways you can learn about the system are to be a poll worker, number one. I always put them first, but also the option to be a poll watcher. So the election law in Pennsylvania provides opportunities for people to get in, to get their hands on the process, to observe close up and personal. And for those folks, and I'll continue to maintain this, for those folks whose trust is lacking, this is the best way to be able to bolster that trust is to either serve as a poll worker, to be a part of the process, or a poll watcher, work for the candidates or the parties to observe what the poll workers are doing. There are ways that you can help yourself learn and build that trust back up.
And Jeff,
And
it's
also,
also, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
I was going to say, in Dauphin County, I always said that I had a little bit of an added benefit because of Dauphin County having the state capitol in its backyard. And so many people who live here either work directly or indirectly or in some way associated with either the federal, state, or local governments, that we had a more trusting electorate here. Most people understood the process. Most people understood the candidates, and they just had more trust in the system. So I always felt a little, uh, you know, guilty in a way that our electorate was very in tune with what's going on because in some way every level of government, federal, state, or locals, in their backyard, and they were accustomed to dealing with it, and the election process generally was well received and accepted. We rarely, if ever, had voters coming in and challenging things. Like I said, in 2016, you had a handful that wanted recounts, and 2020 people didn't want to accept the election results. But for the most part, we were blessed with having a largely accepting and trusting electorate.
In your editorial that appeared in Tuesday's York Dispatch, you wanted to really bring home the fact that Pennsylvania elections are safe and secure. I think most people don't understand what goes into election results post election. Certainly, everyone wants the results quickly. Election directors would prefer they're out accurately. But Jeff, talk about the post election audits and the things that go into making
Yes.
sure that the totals are accurate.
So there is a whole laundry list of things that counties are required to do, beginning with the official canvass 3 days after the election. Obviously, they're doing the mail-in and absentee ballots beginning on election day. But there is a whole laundry list listed in the election code that counties are required to do, including handling all of the provisional ballots, handling write-ins, conducting the official canvass and reconciling the numbers in every precinct in the county. They are also required under Pennsylvania law to do a 2% audit. So they are required to audit 2% of the ballots cast, or 2,000, whichever is fewer. And Pennsylvania, since a court case several years ago, has also implemented what is called a risk limiting audit that counties are also doing prior to certification. So there is a whole thing, a list of things, and apologize for repeating that phrase, that counties are going through up until they certify. I saw a news outlet the other day, and of course, Jerry will appreciate this. I almost jumped off my chair. That literally the day after the election, where the Pennsylvania news outlet said that counties were looking forward to November already. Literally the day after the election. I'm like, no, they're not. They're not. They have to certify first, then they will look forward to November. But again, all of those processes are observable by the candidates and parties, in some cases the public. And so people, again, we can't encourage you more. Reach out to your county and figure out, or your parties and candidates, and figure out where you can observe and watch and see all of these things that counties are doing, including the county commissioners who serve as the board of elections in most counties. again, as they go through all of those processes. This is not just flipping a switch on election night, like you said, Steve, where the media calls a race and it's over. There's nothing over on election night ever, and it's never been that way.
Yeah. And, we also have the up until the Tuesday after election, we have military and overseas ballots that come in, they get added in. And it's a 2 week process till the results are actually official. You have a first certification, and then they lay over on the table. And, whether anybody wants to demand a recount or whatever, there are procedures for that. And then the second certification. So it takes a good 2 weeks, in some cases, 2.5 weeks to finalize an election before you start getting ready for the next one.
I still tell the story in 2020. We had over 8,000 provisional ballots in York County,
Oh, yeah.
and there was four of us trying to do them. If you do one per minute for an 8-hour day, that gets you through 480 of them. So it took us a long, long time. And with Pennsylvania being as tight an election as it was, certainly every one of those counted. Last thoughts, Jerry.
Yes. Well, again, I agree wholeheartedly with Jeff. There's a lot of things that need to be cleaned up to make a more uniform election. The whole mail-in balloting versus bringing in the ballot envelopes and the ballot to turn in to vote a regular ballot, or you got to vote a provisional. So there's things that just need to be cleared up a little bit, cleaned up a little bit. Drop boxes and ballot curing, where a voter sends in a ballot that they didn't use the privacy envelope or they forgot to sign and date it. There are different attacks, different approaches in different counties. And, we need to look at things uniformity. The equal protection clause of the Constitution. If you do something for a voter who mails in the ballot 2 weeks before the election, you got to extend that same courtesy and same right to the voter who only gets the ballot in on election day. And that makes those things challenging, because even if you do everything right, you're going to open yourself up for another potential lawsuit. And we do live in a litigious society. So it is a challenge. We need more clarity. Again, prior to Act 77, there weren't many rule changes on elections. We ran elections the same way for 70, 80 years. And now we're thrown into this situation where there's a little bit of lack of clarity about, are drop boxes legal? If so, how many? Where? Things like that. So we do need more clarity for more uniformity from one county to the next.
Jeff, we'll give you the final word.
Absolutely agree with Jerry. I think 2 points I'll leave you with, again, that have already been raised. One is, it's time for the General Assembly to finish the job. It is no longer workable, feasible for them to continue to leave counties in the positions they've left counties in, opening them up to litigation, election after election. This is on the General Assembly's plate. They can fix it if they want to. And the last point is, again, get involved. If you question, if you have trust issues, get involved as a poll worker or a poll watcher. See the process up close. You will learn and you will see that everything is safe and secure.
Our thanks to Jeff Greenberg, Senior Election Advisor with the Committee of 70 and former Mercer County Election Director, and Jerry Feaser, retired Dauphin County Election Director and the man who saw me through my 2 years in York County. Thank you both for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Thank you, Steve.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Voices of Reason Roundtable. My name is Terry Tracy, CEO of Broad and Liberty. And joining me today, to my left, we're switching roles here today.
We are switching roles today.
Steve Ulrich, Managing Editor of Politics PA, and today also wearing the hat as former Elections Director for the County of York. To my right is Annie Mendoza, Elections Expert with the Elections Group and former Deputy Director of Elections for York County. The esteemed Guy Shiraki, Senior Fellow from the Commonwealth Foundation. Guy, thanks for joining us again today. And new to the Voices of Reason podcast, and thank you for joining us, Carter Walker, reporter for VoteBeat Pennsylvania. Thanks for being here, Carter.
Thanks for having me.
So, Guy, let's start with you. Last Tuesday, we had a primary election, and everybody's trying to read the tea leaves. The big topic of conversation seems to be turnout, one that it was, disproportionately low, and also the mix, Republican versus Democrat, mail versus in-person voting. What should we take away from what happened last week, if anything?
Well, as a softball coach, I have to, softball, baseball coach, I have to say, look, we had spring training. And much like in baseball, this was spring training. We got to see the players got to go out there and stretch their legs and go through the motions. And not much changed about our opinions. We, as Philadelphia fans, we went into it thinking the Phillies were going to be World Series contenders, and spring training didn't change that. We went into this race thinking that the election is going to be very close, and everything that happened in the primary confirmed that. The candidates for the statewide row offices, there's nothing radically dramatic about any of them that's going to suggest that the race is going to shift largely one way or the other. We knew the race for the U.S. Senate would be between Bob Casey and Dave McCormick. Both of them seem well-funded and ready to go. We knew the race for president would be between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Both of them is ready to go. They both have a base of support. So what did we learn that might be insightful? I think first and foremost, mail-in. Republicans have been talking about the need to do it. It appears as though they finally have done it. And much like, the spring training analogy, it is clear that they're serious about it. The numbers moved, not so few that you can dismiss it, but not so overwhelming to say the Republicans are going to bring forth a landslide of mail-in votes. Just enough to say yet another reason the race is going to be close. And the last thing is that there are going to be very few races at the congressional, state senate, or state house level that are truly up for grabs. Unless this suddenly becomes a wave election, this is going to be a very tight race for president, a very tight race for the state house. And I think you're going to see very few races. So a lot of money is going to be spent. Not a lot of seats are going to change hands. But I think the one thing that is confirmed is that we're going to have some sparks. And in all places of Philadelphia, where there's going to be a very hotly contested state house race, and we don't have contested races in Philadelphia, and I think we're going to see one for the first time in a long time.
Annie, by all counts, things ran pretty smoothly last Tuesday, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But given the turnout, it was, to use Guy's analogy, spring training. We know that elections administrators are going to have their hands full with a very busy day in November and very, very busy weeks leading up to that. There's so much variability in the way elections are managed from county to county because we have a highly decentralized system. Is that a good thing? Is that an area where there creates opportunity for folks to have a lack of trust because there's not uniformity across counties? The Department of State does its best to provide guidelines that everyone is supposed to follow, but we also have a lot of new folks in these roles in Pennsylvania this year. How do we make sure that there is trust in the process, given the variability from county to county in how these rules are interpreted and ultimately administered?
Absolutely. So I think that, we do need to have decentralized elections. The way elections are run in Philadelphia is going to look very different from the way elections are run in, let's say, Center County with maybe only tens of thousands of voters. So it does need to be a little bit different. Having a strong Department of State to help guide the counties is very important.
Actually, there's some breaking news that just happened a few minutes ago, and I'm going to throw this one to Carter. Carter, the Third Circuit declined to take up the NAACP case on whether or not mail-in ballots need to be dated. You want to give some background on the case, why it matters, and what might happen if the NAACP appeals to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so this is just the latest development in a string of legal challenges to Pennsylvania's requirement that voters date and sign their mail ballot return envelope. People have been disputing, voting rights groups and voters have been disputing the dating part, saying that this date isn't really relevant to anything, and it creates an unnecessary barrier. And there's a provision in the 1964 Civil Rights Act that says voters can't be barred from registering or other acts requisite to voting for things that are not material to whether or not they're actually an eligible voter. So this most recent case, the NAACP, along with the ACLU and some other voting rights groups, brought challenging the dating requirement on that basis. Last month, we got a ruling from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. The ACLU and NAACP had been successful at the district level, but then Republican groups intervened in the case and appealed it to the Third Circuit, and the NAACP lost there last month, meaning voters for the primary did have to date their ballots for them to be valid. And so the ACLU appealed that decision, wanting a full review from the Third Circuit. But we just found out a couple of minutes ago that the Third Circuit doesn't want to take it up and have all their judges hear it. So, like you said, now the question is going to be whether or not the ACLU and the NAACP appeal that to the U.S. Supreme Court.
And I think this is one of the challenges we have with a decentralized system. And during our conversation with Secretary Schmidt, he basically came out and said 67 counties do things 67 different ways. And until the General Assembly decides that it's going to make everyone do things the same way, what you do in Cumberland County, what you do in Dauphin, what you do in York, which all come together in one triangle, can be three different things. And that certainly riles up the electorate when they hear, well, why is my neighbor allowed to cure their ballot, but I'm not?
Right. I mean, the reality is, and this is anecdotal, but I think for the purposes of today's discussion, it's relevant. There's probably a third of the electorate that really does not trust that our elections are run fairly and accurately. The number of people who now say, my vote doesn't count or won't be counted, or there's corruption or corrosion within the system, I think is reaching a point where it's very dangerous to the health of the republic and the strength of our democracy. Guy, what say you?
No, I agree. And what I've been looking for is, as Steve alluded to, look, there are things the legislature can do. I see the court as sort of the referee, the umpire. Are the rules being followed? But there are things commissioners can do. And again, there are different ways you would approach things in Bradford County than you would Chester County. Differences in Philadelphia and Cumberland County. But here's what you can do across the board. You can have transparency. You can make sure that web pages are up to date. You can make sure that everybody knows where drop boxes are and why. You can make sure that there are watchers. Look, I think to increase the comfort level, when places like Philadelphia talk about satellite offices, I'm here with experts, but to me, if you can go to a place and get a ballot and cast a vote, it's a polling place. I don't care what else you call it. You can also get a cup of coffee there. It's a polling place. And I think it would help if candidates or the parties were allowed to have watchers. We have done that for years at polling places. When you come to vote, there's a Democrat and a Republican that can watch. There should be a Democrat, a Republican, Libertarian, whoever at these offices. So I'm looking at things that increase comfort level, free, accessible, transparent information, having the parties present. And the other is this whole issue of counting, which causes so much angst on election day, where everybody's tension levels are through the roof, and where everyone, from Hawaii to Florida is watching Pennsylvania. I think the commissioners in each county should explain what their counting process is. When will counting start? Are they including the mail-ins in the original account or not? Are the first numbers to appear mail-in or machine? Again, these are little administrative things that go to your issue, Terry, which is how do we increase comfort level? As I say, I want my folks to win, but if I lose, I want to trust the system. Because frankly, for most of us, we want to wake up the next day, celebrate, commiserate, and then go back to work. We don't want these elections to go on for days, weeks, and months where you question the very legitimacy of the men and women in office. We want to be able to go back to work and lead our lives and know that the business of government is going to continue on and you can trust the results. That's what I look at. What can you do to trust the results to increase the likelihood that we can all go back to the business of the rest of our lives and not be fighting about outcomes months and years later? That's what's destructive.
Annie, to Guy's point, there are things that county-level election administrators could do to build greater trust in the process, but it's a balancing act, right, between
Absolutely.
voter privacy and maximum transparency. How do you balance those two considerations, and what recommendations would you make, particularly to those folks who are in these roles who are new, going through a presidential cycle for the first time to address some of the points that Guy made.
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, to have a functioning democracy, we need to question our government. We need to scrutinize the processes. And that's why watchers are so integral to the election process. We have watchers at polling places, and many elections offices invite watchers in at other parts of the process. And I think, for the rest of the season, we have elections here in Pennsylvania at least twice a year, but a lot happens at the other times. Election offices can be putting out the information on their website, on social media. I see many election offices across the country actually doing some sort of election education program. There are different titles that elections offices will make for them, whether it's a certification, a certificate program, election academy, where they'll actually invite the public into their offices through a multi-week program, learning about the different processes from how do you even get on a ballot, how do you create the ballot, to post-election audits and recounts and things like that. So I think bringing the public into the process as much as possible, whether that's in person, whether that's through their website, social media, things like that. Just getting education out there and getting the right information out there.
Steve, one of the other balancing acts is this notion of speed versus accuracy, right? So everybody wants the results of the election as soon as possible, right? The polls close at 8 p.m. At 8:05, everyone's watching the computer screen. Who's up? Who's down? There was this issue in the Supreme Court race last year where it looked like the Republican candidate, Carolyn Carluccio, had a certain number of votes, and then all of a sudden, in the reporting tool that the Department of State uses, and all of a sudden, I forget the number, but it was tens of thousands of votes disappeared. Talk to me about what's going on behind the scenes there, and how you get the public the information that they want and need as quickly as possible, but making sure that these kinds of issues don't undermine trust in the outcome.
Well, in York County, my first election was the 2020 election cycle. We had 159 voting precincts in York County. And what will happen is when the polls close at 8 p.m., judges of election begin their work of closing down the poll and bringing back the materials, typically to a gathering place. For small counties, it could be the county courthouse, it could be an administrative building. And you have to wait throughout the evening for each of the 159 judges in York County to return to the courthouse and turn back in their voting stick, which is just something we'd then plug it into the counting system and begin the work of tabulation. And then after it is put into the countywide system, the stick would be handed to me. I would plug it into a laptop and send it up to Department of State or the voting software, which we began using that year. So there are opportunities for something to go awry, not in terms of if your vote is tabulated correctly, in terms of whether your vote gets from the county tabulation system to the Department of State, because the first thing first is you want to make sure that the county has the number. The Department of State is typically, for most counties, the second thing you do. Mm-hmm. We ran into a situation in York County where we had one of the three commissioners was adamant that York County should be among the first counties to report that evening. And we had a number of conversations with the Board of Commissioners basically saying, we want to do it quickly too, but our first priority is to do it accurately, then as quickly as we can. And when everything was said and done, we still had 8,000 provisional ballots to count, which counties are not allowed to begin counting until 3 days after the election. So this goes into everyone that wants a result quickly can't always get it quickly, particularly in a close election.
Carter, one other sort of related example here is as mail-in ballots come in days and weeks prior to actual election day, there are some counties that have started to count those ballots prior to the polls closing at 8 o'clock on election day, and which precludes, to a point Guy made earlier, observers or watchers from being able to be there while that process is happening. And it seems that, again, the elections administrators are trying to get those votes counted as quickly as possible because it's become such a meaningful portion of the electorate. But without poll watchers or observers able to be there, again, it opens up questions about, the efficacy of the process. What say you? What kind of latitude should county administrators be able to have? What opportunities are there for the legislator to address sort of, the areas where the election code, just having not been updated for so long, is not addressing these specificities that are really fueling a lot of the debate around this particular issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as I know, you're right. There are counties operate on some different schedules. They're not allowed to start opening the ballots before the morning of election day, but generally when the morning starts, they kick it off, they start opening their ballots. As far as I'm aware, though, poll watchers are allowed to observe that process. That I've been to a number of counting operations in Chester County and Lancaster and Snyder County and elsewhere, and poll watchers from various political parties are there if they choose to be, so they can observe it. And to the transparency point that Guy was bringing up, a lot of counties have also opted to live stream that process on their website. And as you were speaking about, one of the things I find in my reporting a lot when I speak with political candidates and voters and poll workers like judges of elections is the closer they end up getting to the voting process, the actual mechanics of it, of how the polls get set up and how they operate and how these ballots get counted, the more they say, oh, okay, well, I was questioning X part of the process, but now seeing it in person, I really, I can see that it's operating well. That's a pretty consistent thing you find, is that the more people see in the process, the more that they end up trusting it. The refrain you often hear is, at least in this county. So I think that's one thing that folks can do to increase the trust. Guy, I believe you're from Chester County. Chester County has a program where they've been making videos and live streaming almost every part of their elections management that they can. And I think that's been successful in dissuading some mistrust there.
I know it's important for people to understand that when counties do their logic and accuracy testing for their machines, typically the county chairs, the Republicans and the Democratic chairs, are invited to be part of that and see how the machines are calibrated and that they're ready to go. And I think that always kind of chaps elections folks when you hear someone associated with a county going, well, the machine's faulty. Well, no, you had the opportunity to come in and be part of it.
Yeah. We still have a ways to go, right? And, I've always operated on, the three-part premise: easy to vote, hard to cheat, results we can trust. And as we often do in America, the pendulum swings. I think we get an A++ on easy to vote. At this point, if you're not registered to vote or you don't vote, you're not interested, right? I may be biased, but I don't think there's a straight-faced argument that says it's hard to register or hard to vote. We have bent over backwards to do that part of it. Hard to cheat as we get into the more people touching ballots, and to Carter's point, like the more transparency, the more watchers, the more live stream helps. But with drop boxes and all this stuff and curing ballots, the lawyer in me, the former prosecutor in me, talks about a chain of custody. The more people touching a ballot, the more people coming into contact. Look, even if you think they're being handled, by the Sisters of Mercy, just the more people touching it gives me apprehension. But then results you can trust. Again, the idea of satellite offices, of even drop boxes. I mean, let's step back. Drop boxes are one of those things that are not required or even really permitted by statute. They're not prohibited. They were put in place to get us through COVID. Almost all of us recognize that's over. We're now down to drop boxes being used, and as I was told in Chester County by our commissioners, because people like them. Well, people like a lot of things. But again, going back to results we can trust, where are the drop boxes? Are watchers permitted? Who are they? When the ballots are picked up, who picks them up? Where do they go? And again, let me be clear. I don't necessarily think that there's a nefarious plot of people meeting in a basement somewhere. I'm just saying I want to know that as we're on the heels of a race where it's very likely that Donald Trump or Joe Biden are going to win by a point or less, where the nation is on edge, it should be a bipartisan, citizen approach that let's have results we can trust. There are going to be enough hurt feelings and anger. Let's have everybody wake up the day after and believe that win or lose, that it was done transparently and we can explain what happened and why. And then, as I said, the rest of us go back to our business of leading our lives.
And Governor Shapiro appointed an election security task force. What recommendations would you have for that group in the run-up to the general election to address some of the criticisms that Guy just raised?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say just talk to local elections officials directly. That's where they're going to get their best information. Election officials are the experts on what happens in their county or what happens in counties nearby. There's a lot of collaboration, a lot of really good things happening between the counties in Pennsylvania. So just go in there, go talk to them, see what it's like day to day. Maybe go in a couple days leading up to the election, go in on election day, or go in during the summer, maybe when the main election season isn't happening, but a lot of other things are going on in the office.
Carter, there was a court case that you may or may not be familiar with, but it was in the Delaware County Court of Common Pleas recently over an ordinance change that the Delaware County Council had made regarding their ability to appoint the minority party representative on the elections board. So there are 2 Democrats and there's 1 Republican. The Democrats are the majority party in Pennsylvania, and they passed an ordinance basically saying that the majority party had unfettered discretion over the minority party appointment. So if they did not like the minority party nominee, they had the ability to go and pick a different representative from the minority party in order to serve on that board. Ultimately, the ordinance was overturned. I believe in January, the Republican National Committee got involved and sued the county government, and the court found in the favor of the minority party in this case. But I think that's an instructive example of the kinds of partisan jockeying that goes on at the county level, where that folks may not necessarily be aware of, but it can create the perception that county officials have the ability to put their thumb on the scale. What kind of oversight should there be in order to prevent things like this happening? Obviously, the legal system was able to reconcile it, but it seems like the kind of thing that election official or county officials should not have the kind of latitude to do.
Right. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the court case, but I do remember reading about when the council was looking to reject some of those appointees. And there was a similar issue up in Luzerne County where they were considering restructuring the way their election board works up there, similar structure with a set number of minority party, set number of majority party, and then they vote on the 5th one. It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure exactly if there's a solution to wholly get away from the idea of having some kind of politics exercised over election administration. I'm trying to be careful with my word choice here because at the end of the day, Steve's boss when he was an election director were county commissioners, elected officials who run on a political platform, and I think people do want that to an extent. You want to have some kind of elected representation making those kind of decisions. I don't think folks would want to see it entirely left to some kind of meritocracy, bureaucratic system. So I know election administrators probably feel strongly that they do know the best ways to run these, and they are, very strongly nonpartisan folks. So that's tough to answer exactly how you could avoid that perception while still maintaining, some ability of the voters to have control over these important systems.
I remember back in 2020, the days leading up to the election, when you could come to the county courthouse, request the mail-in ballot, get it, vote. We were we did not have a full staff. And trying to make sure that we were handling the actual mail-in request, trying to get people registered, trying to handle a line that went, if those of you are familiar with the York County Courthouse, in the basement, we had a line of 50 people running up the stairs waiting to cast a vote. What do you think we can do as election folks to appeal to those who make these decisions to make it better, improve things?
So again, I'm always of the approach of what can you do to get most people comfortable, right? Because there'll always be a few people, right? It's especially important in Pennsylvania because, to exaggerate the point, I hope and pray as an American that California runs their elections well. But, I'm going to go out on a limb here. Joe Biden's going to carry California. I hope and pray that they run elections well in Alabama, but Donald Trump's going to carry Alabama. It is really critical in these states that we now know historically, the 6 or 7 or 8 states, and ours being one of them, that are razor tight, that the process is fair or square. Donald Trump carried this state by less than a point. He fell short by just over a point. We need to all wake up the next day in Pennsylvania, first of all, and around the nation, and it's right. So to me, it begins with transparency. It begins with explaining the rules, making sure that on your webpage it's understood what's going on. Second, that there's an accountability, that the commissioners explain it. And to Terry's point earlier, that it's not just simply, well, we have the votes. I mean, I have a partisan bias, but I still ask, it's 2024. There's every reason to believe that there are going to be 14 drop boxes in Chester County. Why? Several of them are in front of the post office in some of the towns. Literally. I mean, I'm not making this up, Carter. You don't have to save me here as a lifeline, but in Kennett Square, in Honeybrook, they're in front. In Westchester, in front of the Government Services Building. I mean, you drive up to the Government Services Building, and there's a drop box there where you could park your car and walk in 100 yards. So, again, I don't think people are sitting in their basement rolling their hands saying, I'm going to scheme. But it just, as an average citizen, you say, why? Why is this there? Why allow for moments? So to me, it's transparency. Where are the drop boxes and why? What are the process, as we've talked about here? Just explain. Who picks up the ballots? Where do they go? When will they be counted? Put that on live stream. In Philadelphia back in 2020, the counting of ballots was open, but they were 110 yards away. I mean, I wear glasses, but even if my eyesight was perfect, you can't sit in the end zone at Heinz Field or the Link and watch what's going on in the opposite end zone, right? And again, let's assume it was honest, but why? So what you can do is the rules have to be clear, the rules have to be transparent, and this has to be done with an eye towards what is happening and why, and can you explain it to someone without the sense that there's a partisan basis for it. Look, and I just want to flag something in our region. Montgomery County is considering, in the curing process, of having county employees drive the ballots to voters' homes to allow them to fix them in their house. A ballot has been submitted to the courthouse by a voter. Someone's going to determine that the date is missing, as Carter talked about us earlier. Okay. And if sending Guy 2 emails, I don't respond, someone's going to pick up that ballot, put it in their car, and drive it to me, and then magically return and say, hey, I found Guy. He was sitting at home watching Columbo reruns. Thank goodness he was there. He dated his ballot, and here it is. Results we can trust? I mean, I hope that cooler heads prevail and that while we understand that rural Pennsylvania is different than suburban Pennsylvania, that's different than urban, results we can trust. Let's not start taking ballots out of the courthouse and driving them to people's homes, right? That should be a bipartisan. Win, lose, or draw. Look, I hope my folks win, but I hope everybody can trust what happened the next day. And that should be the focus. For professionals like you, you should be able to say, win, lose, or draw. I don't have a dog in this fight. I can explain to you what happened and why.
And that partisan breakdown, particularly with the mail-in voting, I think is something that confounds a lot of critics of the system. They look at the results for Democrats amongst mail-in voters, and they say that is near a statistical impossibility. Right in their minds, it is a near statistical impossibility that a state that is this evenly divided would yield a subset of that electorate that's voting by a very new process could yield overwhelming majorities for one party over the other. How is it that the Democrats in such a short period of time were able to absolutely perfect the ability to drive huge margins and increased incremental turnout for their party, and Republicans are somehow completely ineffectual and unable to do this? Now, there are lots of explanations around what was going on in the political world, but I think for folks who feel uncomfortable with what's happened since Act 77 was passed, that's the kind of thing that they point to and say, it doesn't add up. Steve, what kind of insights? you
Well,
have?
I was going to yield to my right, actually.
Annie, help us out.
So in the past few years, there have been groups that were told not to vote by mail. So they didn't vote by mail. So you saw other groups where their vote by mail voting method was stronger. But going back to your point a little bit, Guy, when you mentioned that it's easy to vote. And I think there are many areas of the country where it's still very hard to vote, be it restrictive voter registration laws or gerrymandering, or in our case in Pennsylvania, putting the date on the mail ballot. You don't have to do that at the polling place. It's completely insignificant for elections offices. They know when the ballot's going out. They know when the ballot's coming back. The date doesn't mean anything. So why was the law set in place originally that there needs to be a date on the ballot? I just wonder, what was the intention of that from our legislators? And why do they feel that that is so significant when for elections offices, that's not significant at all?
Probably the most significant action the legislature has taken since the passage of Act 77 was a bill that was signed by Governor Wolf in 2022, which outlawed the private funding of elections administration and provided incremental funding to county administrators who said that they were feeling very constrained by the changes to the law and the fallout from COVID. But there were strings attached with increased state funding. Counties were required to conduct an internal audit, which was supposed to be submitted to the Department of State and made publicly available. To my view, that has happened very intermittently. And my understanding is that the increased funding is still available. What action should the legislator take, Annie? And on to that point, and Guy, Steve, Carter, please all jump in here. It seems like the legislator had an inclination that there were tweaks to the changes in the system that needed to be made, but we're doing them in baby steps, and again, partisan gridlock prevents us from getting to where we ultimately need to be.
Sure. So with the ban of outside funding for elections offices in Pennsylvania came Act 88 with the increase of funding, which was huge. And Pennsylvania is one of the few states in the country that banned outside funding, but then provided the additional funding needed. So kudos to Pennsylvania for that. I think that honestly, the election code was written in 1937, and society today is extremely different. Even look at 20 years ago. And so I believe that the entire election code probably just needs to be completely rewritten based on today's standards. The funding certainly helps for Pennsylvania counties, but there's a lot of lack of funding across the country. The Bipartisan Policy Center says that elections need about $2 billion in funding, but the federal government has only allotted about $55 million for counties or for states this year. And so in 2020, there was about $425 million that was given to states across the country. So there's a lot of funding that still needs to be implemented.
Briefly, just to add to the election code, to Annie's point, very rarely I defy anyone in Pennsylvania to have gone to a polling place and seen a lantern hung outside, because that is written into the election code from 1937. Ask your local county officials whether they have enough lanterns to cover their polling places.
Yeah. So, look, what I wish they would come forward and do is to find a balance that's very Pennsylvania, to set forth clear rules, to focus on transparency and clarity, and then let them be applied. Philadelphia is different than York. York is different than Snyder. Snyder's different than Allegheny. But what can we do? I would prefer, if we're going to go forward with drop boxes, that we don't go under the belief or under the operation that the statute doesn't prohibit them, so they can. I think if we're going to have drop boxes, if the feedback from the counties is they're a useful tool, then let's explain where they can be located, what are their hours of operation, and whether to do it. At the end of the day, Snyder County might choose not to use any. Philadelphia might have 30. But let's understand where they can and cannot be placed. Let's not put them in front of a legislator's office, for example. Let's decide where they can and can't be and who can watch. Let's talk about this curing of ballots, when they can and can't be. Because again, 67 counties and our friends in Montgomery talking about driving ballots to people's homes. Let's have rules, let's have them applied, and then let's decide. And it's easier in smaller counties than it is in larger. But what are the parameters? Again, I'm in favor of that. Look, if we want to reopen this, I think we should have a real discussion about what early voting is. Because in Pennsylvania, as you know, I'm here with the experts, but we used to have excuse absentee. Now we have no excuse mail. And now we're in this gray area of early voting where we really don't have early voting, but you can show up in person and ask for a mail-in ballot and complete a mail-in ballot, which seems strangely similar to early voting in states like Florida, but we don't call it early voting. So as Annie's point, we're in a different era. Maybe we should have an honest, nonpartisan discussion about what should elections look like. When should we start voting? When not? Who can show up early and who can't? What happens to that ballot? How is it counted? How is it cured? Those are the things that, Republicans might treat it a different way. Rural counties might treat it a different way. But let's agree what the rules are, and then the counties apply them rather than each county coming up with what appears to be its own rules on counting and curing and drop boxes. Because, again, results we can trust. That is paramount to me. Results we can trust. Whatever we can do to all know the rules. You can't play a baseball game and change the strike zone in the fourth inning and just say, well, we're doing the best we can to adapt. We can't do that. We need results we can trust.
Carter?
Unless you're Angel Hernandez, but that's another.
True. Carter, final thoughts.
Yeah, if I could jump in. I mean, to echo Steve and Annie, the law is very outdated. It was compiled in 1937, but a lot of the provisions date back before that. And there are some funny stuff in there, like the lantern and whatnot. But there's also provisions that are in there and some that aren't that really don't make sense. Like, for example, we're supposed to conduct our elections on daylight not on daylight savings time, but the state operates on daylight savings time since that code was passed now. So we have a law on that, but we don't have like a very defined statute on something like logic and accuracy testing. Like, what are the exact steps that we need to take to test our electronic voting equipment, and how do we document that process? And to Guy's point, a lot of these decisions on how do we do X, Y, and Z, like, are we going to have drop boxes? Are we going to allow curing? It comes down to the Board of Commissioners in a given county. And that, of course, comes down to the partisan breakdown of that Board of Commissioners. So one of the things I hear most often from voters or folks in politics like Guy or election administrators is, yeah, we do need the legislature to step in. We need some more uniformity and clarification on these parts of the rules. Like, they of course want to have the ability to make decisions for the voters in their districts and what they would like, but on things like curing and pre-canvassing, drop boxes, logic and accuracy testing, most people I think want to see more uniformity across the state.
I will say, if there is one theme that's emerging, Steve, here on the Voices of Reason Roundtable, is we really need the legislator to do ...
Absolutely.
It seems to be something that's come up more than once or twice. That's all the time we have for today. Carter Walker, thank you very much. Guy Shiraki, Annie Mendoza, Steve, a pleasure as always. We'll be right back.
And a special thank you to our guests today, Secretary of the Commonwealth Al Schmidt, Jeff Greenberg, Gary Fieser, Annie Mendoza, Carter Walker, and Guy Shiraki. My name is Steve Ulrich for Voices of Reason. Thank you for watching.